My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 32. The look on my brother's face when he walked into the conference room was everything I had dreamed of for the past 8 months. Pure, undiluted terror. Rebecca, his wife, went completely white, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. I smiled. It was a cold smile, the kind you learn when you've been to hell and clawed your way back. "Hello, Daniel," I said, my voice steady as granite. "Rebecca, you both look like you've seen a ghost. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt the sweet satisfaction of watching someone get exactly what they deserve. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. 8 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting across from my brother and sister-in-law, watching them squirm like insects under a microscope, I would have laughed. Back then, I still believed in family loyalty. I still thought blood meant something. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. But let me start from the beginning, because this beautiful, terrible story of betrayal and justice, it starts with what should have been the saddest day of my life. The day my parents died in what everyone believed was a tragic accident. The day that set everything in motion. It was January 15th, a cold Tuesday night when the call came. Mom and Dad driving home from their anniversary dinner at Giuseppe's, the same restaurant where they'd had their first date 40 years ago. A drunk driver ran a red light at Pine and 4th Avenue. They never saw it coming. Daniel called me at 11:30, his voice hollow and strange. "Sarah, there's been an accident." The next few hours were a blur of hospital corridors, police reports, and the kind of paperwork that death requires. The other driver, a 23-year-old named Tyler Morrison, had been drinking at a fraternity reunion. His blood alcohol was twice the legal limit. He walked away with a broken arm and some cuts. My parents didn't walk away at all. The funeral was packed. Richard and Margaret Mitchell had owned a successful chain of hardware stores throughout Washington state, built from nothing starting in 1978. They were respected in the community, loved by their employees, and mourned by hundreds of people whose lives they'd touched. I remember very little of the service except Daniel giving the eulogy, his voice steady and professional, and Rebecca's hand on my shoulder when I couldn't stop crying during Mom's favorite hymn. At the time, I was grateful for their support, Looking back now, with perfect clarity about what came next, I can see things differently. During the reception at their house afterward, Daniel pulled me aside. "Sarah, we need to start thinking about practical things. The business, their estate, all the decisions that need to be made." I nodded numbly, still in shock. "Whatever you think is best. You're the lawyer. I'll handle everything," he assured me. "But we should probably meet with their attorney soon, Harrison Walsh. Dad mentioned updating their will recently, but I'm not sure if they actually did it." 3 weeks later, Walsh called both of us to his downtown office. I expected a simple reading may be enough to pay off my student loans, help me put a down payment on a house. I never expected to walk out of there as a millionaire. "To my beloved daughter, Sarah Mitchell," Walsh read from the legal document, "who has always followed her heart and chosen her own path with courage and integrity, I leave 60% of our estate, including all properties, investments, and business holdings." The words hit me like a physical blow. 60% of an estate valued at $14 million. I was rich beyond my wildest dreams. "To my son Daniel Mitchell," Walsh continued, "I leave 40% of the remaining estate, with the knowledge that he has already built a successful career and a stable future for his family." Daniel's face went through a series of expressions: shock, confusion, and then something darker that I didn't recognize at the time, something that should have warned me of what was coming. "I don't understand," he said carefully. "Why would they leave Sarah more? I'm the older child. I have children to provide for." Walsh looked uncomfortable. "Your parents didn't discuss their reasoning with me in detail, but they seemed very certain about these arrangements." I was still processing the numbers. $8.4 million. Enough to quit teaching, travel the world, open the art gallery I'd always dreamed of. Enough to change my life completely. "Daniel," I said, trying to process his obvious hurt, "this doesn't change anything between us. We're still family." But I was wrong about that too. The inheritance changed everything, just not in the ways I expected. That night, I lay in my small Capitol Hill apartment, staring at the legal documents and wondering if I was dreaming. My parents, who I'd always thought saw me as the disappointing daughter, had trusted me with their legacy. They'd chosen me to carry on what they'd built. I should have been happy, should have been planning my new life, thinking about all the possibilities that $8 million could buy. Instead, all I could think about was the look in Daniel's eyes and the way his jaw had tightened when Walsh read the will. For the first time in my life, I was afraid of my older brother. I should have trusted that instinct. 3 days later, Daniel called with a suggestion that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. Sarah, Rebecca, and I were talking, and we think you should consider hiring a financial advisor. This kind of money, it's a lot of responsibility. That's probably smart, I agreed. Do you know anyone good? Actually, yes. Rebecca knows someone excellent. Patricia Chen. She specializes in sudden wealth management, lottery winners, inheritance recipients, that sort of thing. Patricia Chen turned out to be charming, professional, and very interested in helping me make smart decisions with my newfound wealth. What I didn't know then was that Patricia had been carefully chosen to feed Daniel information about my plans, my vulnerabilities, and my growing sense of isolation as I struggled to process my parents' death and my unexpected fortune. The trap was already being set, piece by careful piece, and I walked right into it. Before everything went to hell, my life was simple. Simple and, I thought, pretty good. I taught second grade at Riverside Elementary, lived in a cozy one-bedroom apartment with a view of the Space Needle, and spent my weekends painting watercolors at Pike Place Market. Not glamorous, maybe, but it was mine. Daniel was 35, 3 years older, and had always been the golden child. Captain of the debate team, valedictorian, full scholarship to University of Washington Law School. He married Rebecca right after passing the bar exam. She came from money. Her father owned an art gallery in Pioneer Square. They had 2 kids, Emma, now 9, and Michael, 7. The perfect nuclear family living in a beautiful colonial in Bellevue. Meanwhile, I was the artsy one, the dreamer, the one who chose teaching over corporate law, who drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic while Daniel drove a BMW. At family dinners, conversations revolved around Daniel's latest legal victories or Rebecca's gallery connections. My stories about second graders learning to read rarely commanded the same attention, but I didn't mind. At least I told myself I didn't mind. I loved my students, loved watching their faces light up when they finally grasped a concept they'd been struggling with. I loved my independence, my freedom from the corporate pressure that seemed to consume Daniel's life. My parents owned Mitchell Hardware, 5 locations throughout Western Washington that Dad had built from a single Tacoma store in 1978. Mom kept the books and managed daily operations. They weren't Seattle wealthy, but they were comfortable. Comfortable enough to put both Daniel and me through college debt-free, comfortable enough for annual Hawaii vacations, comfortable enough that money was never a source of stress in our family, or so I thought. The relationship with my parents was typical for adults in their 30s. Sunday dinners every other week at their Queen Anne house, holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations for the grandkids. Mom always made pot roast. Dad always asked about my dating life with the subtle desperation of a man who wanted more grandchildren. Sarah, honey, Mom would say, passing the mashed potatoes. Mrs. Patterson from church has a nephew who's a doctor at Swedish Medical. Very nice young man. Mom, I'm happy being single right now, was my standard response. These conversations happened monthly, like clockwork, while Daniel and Rebecca represented success personified, honor roll kids, stable marriage, bright future mapped out in 5-year increments. If I'm being honest, there were moments I envied them. Not the money necessarily, but the certainty. They knew exactly who they were supposed to be, exactly what success looked like. I was still figuring that out at 32. The last time I saw my parents alive was at Emma's 9th birthday party in early January. Rebecca had hired a professional party planner despite the Seattle drizzle, complete with a bounce house and at least 30 kids running around high on sugar and excitement. I spent most of the party in the kitchen with Mom, cutting cake and refilling juice boxes. It was easier than making small talk with Rebecca's art world friends, most of whom looked at me like I was wearing a disappointing sister-in-law name tag. Sarah, Mom said, handing me another stack of paper plates, I want you to know how proud Dad and I are of you. The comment caught me off guard. Thanks, Mom. That means a lot. She paused in her cake cutting, looking thoughtful. You chose your own path instead of doing what other people expected. That takes real courage. At the time, I assumed it was just Mom being Mom, making sure I didn't feel overshadowed at another celebration of Daniel and Rebecca's perfect life. Now I realize it was something more. A hint of decisions they'd already made. 10 days later, they were dead. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday, January 15th. I was grading spelling tests, half watching a Friends rerun, when my phone rang. Daniel's name on caller ID. Sarah. His voice was wrong, hollow and distant. There's been an accident. Tyler Morrison, 23 years old, had been drinking at his old fraternity house. Blood alcohol level 0.16, twice the legal limit. He ran a red light at Pine and 4th Avenue going 45 miles per hour. Mom and Dad never had a chance to react. The next few hours were a nightmare of hospital corridors, police reports, and administrative details that death requires. Tyler Morrison walked away with a broken arm. My parents were pronounced dead at the scene. I remember fragments. Daniel's steady voice handling logistics, Rebecca appearing with coffee and tissues, the police officer explaining what happened with clinical detachment. The drunk driving statistics he rattled off, the legal procedures we'd need to follow, the timeline for releasing their bodies. What I don't remember is grieving. The shock was too complete, too overwhelming. I moved through those first days like a sleepwalker, letting Daniel handle the funeral arrangements, the business decisions, the 100 details that needed attention. "I'll take care of everything," he assured me repeatedly. "You just focus on getting through this." The funeral was everything you'd expect: packed church, beautiful flowers, speeches about how Richard and Margaret Mitchell had touched so many lives. Their employees spoke about fair treatment and genuine kindness. Community members shared stories of quiet generosity and support during difficult times. Daniel's eulogy was masterful, painting our parents as the embodiment of American dreams achieved through hard work and integrity. He spoke about their values, their love for family, their pride in both their children's achievements. His voice never wavered, his composure never cracked. At the time, I was grateful for his strength. Looking back now, I can see it differently. Daniel wasn't grieving the way I was. He was performing. After the service, during the reception at Daniel and Rebecca's house, he approached me with that careful expression I was starting to recognize as his planning face. "Sarah, I know this is difficult timing, but we need to discuss practical matters. The business accounts, their personal finances, estate planning. There are time-sensitive issues that can't wait." I nodded numbly. "Whatever you think is best. I'll handle the immediate concerns, but we should meet with their attorney soon, Harrison Walsh." He mentioned that Mom and Dad had been discussing updates to their will recently. Updates? Nothing major, probably. Just making sure everything was current. But we should understand exactly what we're dealing with. Over the next few weeks, Daniel managed everything. He met with accountants, settled debts, handled insurance claims. He kept me informed with brief phone updates, but in the distant way you might brief a colleague about a project they weren't directly involved in. "The business is worth more than we expected," he told me during one call. "Dad was better with investments than any of us realized." "That's good, I guess." The will reading is scheduled for March 8th. Walsh's office downtown, 10 a.m. I wrote it in my calendar and tried not to think about it. In my mind, there might be enough to pay off my student loans, maybe take a small vacation to clear my head. I never imagined millions. Certainly never imagined it would make me a target. But Daniel was already calculating, already planning, already seeing opportunities that wouldn't occur to someone genuinely grieving their parents' death. Looking back, I can see signs I missed. The way his questions about the business became increasingly detailed. The way Rebecca started mentioning their mounting credit card debt and Michael's expensive learning disability tutoring. The way they both seemed unusually interested in the specifics of Mom and Dad's estate. I was mourning the loss of my parents. They were appraising the value of their death. The first sign that something was wrong came 5 days after I told Daniel about the inheritance. I was coming home from school, arms full of art projects my students had made for spring display, when I noticed my apartment door was slightly ajar. Not wide open. Just enough to show a sliver of darkness beyond the frame, like someone had closed it without making sure the latch caught properly. I stood in the hallway for a full minute, heart hammering, certain I'd locked it that morning. I always had ever since moving to the city. My hands shook as I pushed the door open wider and called out tentatively, "Hello? Is someone here?" No response. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning my small living room. Nothing looked obviously disturbed. My laptop was still on the coffee table, my purse hanging where I always left it. But something felt different. The air itself felt different, like someone had been breathing in my space. I checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Nothing was missing. The envelope containing copies of the inheritance papers was still in my desk drawer, apparently untouched. My small jewelry collection was undisturbed. Even my emergency cache behind the bathroom mirror remained there. But I knew someone had been inside. I called my building manager first. "Mr. Peterson, was any maintenance scheduled for my unit today?" "No maintenance on the calendar." "Sarah, is there a problem? I think someone might have been in my apartment." "You want me to call the police?" I hesitated. What would I tell them? Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. A door that might have been left unlocked wasn't exactly evidence of a crime. "No, not yet. Maybe I just forgot to lock it properly this morning." But I knew I hadn't. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the building, the elevator, footsteps in hallway, pipes settling sent adrenaline coursing through my system. I kept my phone next to my pillow and jumped at every notification buzz. The second incident happened exactly 1 week later. I was at the grocery store on Sunday morning when my phone rang. Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor who lived across the hall. "Sarah, dear, there are men at your apartment door." They said they're from the gas company, checking for leaks? I froze between the cereal and coffee aisles. Gas company? On a Sunday? That's what I thought was odd. They have uniforms and clipboards, but something feels strange about them. One of them asked when you usually come home. Mrs. Chen, please don't tell them anything. And if you can, keep an eye on my door until I get back. I abandoned my shopping and drove home faster than was probably safe, but by the time I arrived, the men were gone. Mrs. Chen met me in the hallway, clearly worried. They left about 15 minutes ago, she reported. 2 men, both in their 30s, white, average height. They had official-looking equipment, but they didn't smell like utility workers. What do you mean? She sniffed delicately. Gas company workers smell like work like tools and truck interiors. These men smelled like expensive cologne. I thanked her and checked my apartment again. Once more, nothing appeared missing or disturbed, but that same unsettling feeling lingered. Someone had been going through my things carefully, professionally, looking for something specific. This time I called the police. Officer Martinez was polite but skeptical as he filled out his report. No forced entry, nothing missing, no witnesses to any actual crime. Could be scammers casing the building, could be a legitimate mix-up with the utility company. I think someone is watching me, I said directly. Ma'am, I understand your concern, but without evidence of an actual crime, there's not much we can do. I'll file this report, but unless something concrete happens... After he left, I sat in my living room trying to decide whether I was being paranoid or appropriately cautious. $8 million was life-changing money. Maybe it attracted attention I wasn't prepared for. Maybe random people were targeting me somehow. But deep down, I suspected this wasn't random. I called Daniel. Someone broke into my apartment, I told him without preamble. Twice. Broke in? Sarah, are you sure? Maybe you're just stressed. Grief can make us imagine things that aren't really happening. The dismissiveness in his voice stung. Daniel, I'm not imagining this. Someone has been inside my apartment going through my things. Have you called the police? Yes, but they can't do anything since nothing was stolen. There was a pause, then. Sarah, maybe you should consider moving somewhere more secure. With your inheritance, you can afford a place with better security now. Doorman, cameras, that sort of thing. It was a reasonable suggestion, but something about his tone bothered me, like he'd been thinking about my security situation already. I like my apartment, I said. I just want to figure out who's doing this. Well, be careful, and let me know if anything else happens. 2 weeks later, something else did happen, and this time, I didn't tell Daniel about it. I had started varying my routine different departure times, different routes to work, different grocery stores. Call it paranoia, but after 2 break-ins, I wasn't taking chances. That Tuesday, I claimed a doctor's appointment and left school at 2:30 instead of my usual 4:15. The elevator in my building is old and loud. You can hear it throughout the floor when someone gets on or off. But that afternoon, as I approached my door with keys ready, I heard the stairwell door close. Softly, carefully, like someone trying not to be noticed. I froze, listening. Footsteps going down the stairs, quick but quiet. I crept to the stairwell window that overlooked the street, and arrived just in time to see someone in a dark jacket and baseball cap walking purposefully toward a black sedan parked across the street. The car was close enough to see the driver clearly when he turned to talk to his passenger, close enough to recognize the profile, the way he held his head, the gestures he made while speaking, close enough to recognize my brother. I stood at that window for 20 minutes after they drove away, my world tilting on its axis. There had to be an innocent explanation. Daniel practiced law in this part of town. Maybe he'd had business nearby. Maybe he'd stopped by to check on me and I'd just missed him. Maybe the person I'd seen wasn't even him. But I knew better. I knew with a cold, clear certainty that made me feel sick and frightened and completely alone. My brother was having me watched. That night, I pulled out the inheritance papers and read them more carefully than I had before. Really studied them, looking for details that might explain Daniel's behavior, clauses that might give him motivation to keep tabs on my activities. Page 7 contained the answer. Should Sarah Mitchell predecease Daniel Mitchell or be declared legally incompetent to manage her affairs, her portion of the estate shall revert entirely to Daniel Mitchell. 60% of $14 million. 8.4 million reasons for Daniel to want me gone. I sat on my living room floor surrounded by legal documents, and for the first time since my parents died, I wasn't sad. The grief that had been my constant companion for 2 months was burning away, replaced by something harder and more focused. My brother wanted me dead, but I wasn't dead yet. And now that I knew what I was dealing with, I could start fighting back. Daniel played his role perfectly right up until the moment he tried to kill me. After discovering he was having me surveilled, I became hyper-aware of every interaction, every phone call, every seemingly innocent suggestion. But he was skilled at manipulation, lawyer skilled, and he knew exactly how to exploit my grief and isolation. "Sarah, you look exhausted," Rebecca observed when I joined them for dinner on a Friday evening in late May. We were eating on their back deck, while Emma and Michael chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. It was warm enough to sit outside, the kind of Seattle evening that made you forget about 9 months of rain and clouds. "I'm sleeping better now," I lied, picking at the grilled salmon on my plate. In truth, I'd been sleeping terribly for weeks. Every sound in my building woke me up. I'd installed 2 additional deadbolts and kept a baseball bat beside my bed. Daniel leaned forward with practiced concern. "You know, Rebecca's right. You seem stressed, isolated. Maybe you should take a vacation, get away from the city for a while. Clear your head. I can't just abandon my students in the middle of the school year. School ends in 3 weeks," he pointed out reasonably. "You could go anywhere you want. With your inheritance, money isn't a concern." There it was again, the inheritance. He brought it up constantly, like he was reminding himself of the prize he was working toward. "I've been thinking about it," I said, watching his reaction. "Maybe somewhere quiet, away from people." Rebecca's eyes brightened with interest. And "That sounds perfect for you. You could finally focus on your art without distractions. Somewhere with water access would be ideal," Daniel added casually. "The sound of waves is supposed to be very therapeutic. Plus, waterfront property values are excellent if you decide you want something permanent." Water access. Something about the phrase made my skin crawl, though I couldn't articulate why at the time. Later, I would understand exactly why he'd suggested it. After dinner, Daniel walked me to my car while Rebecca cleaned up inside. The street was quiet, their neighbors' houses glowing warmly in the summer twilight. It should have felt peaceful and familiar. Instead, I felt like prey being examined by a predator. "Sarah, I want you to know how proud I am of how you're handling everything," he said, leaning against my Honda Civic. "Mom and Dad would be amazed to see how strong you've become." "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you. I also want you to know that no matter what happens in the future, we're family. You can always come to me if you need anything at all." The sincerity in his voice was flawless. If I hadn't seen him having me watch, hadn't read that clause about my death reverting the inheritance to him, I would have hugged him gratefully. Instead, I felt like I was looking at a stranger wearing Daniel's face. "I appreciate that more than you know," I managed. "Drive safely. Text me when you get home." I watched him in my rearview mirror as I drove away. He stood in his driveway until my car disappeared around the corner, his silhouette dark against the porch light. Watching. Always watching. The following week brought Daniel's suggestion that should have sent every alarm bell in my head ringing at maximum volume. "Rebecca found this incredible property listing," he said during his Tuesday evening call, our new routine since Mom and Dad died. "It's on Whidbey Island, right on the water. The owner is motivated to sell and agreed to a weekend showing. I told you I'm not ready to buy anything yet. You don't have to buy it. Just look. Rebecca thinks you'd love it, and honestly, you need to get out of the city. You've been isolating yourself lately." "Isolating myself, because someone was monitoring my every move. We could all drive up Saturday," he continued. "Make a family day of it. The kids would love the ferry ride, and we haven't spent time together since the funeral." The guilt manipulation was expertly applied. How could I refuse a family outing? How could I say no when they were trying so hard to help me heal? "I suppose Saturday would be okay," I heard myself agreeing. "Perfect. The showing is at 2, so we'll pick you up around 11. That gives us time for lunch at that place you loved as kids, remember? Deception Pass, Bridge Calf." Another perfect touch. A reference to happy childhood memories, to our parents, to times when we'd actually been a loving family. Daniel was exceptionally good at this. Saturday morning, I stood at my apartment window watching for his BMW. Anxiety and anticipation warring in my stomach. Part of me, the part that desperately wanted to believe my brother loved me, looked forward to a day away from the city, to the possibility that maybe I really was being paranoid about everything. The other part, the part that had learned to trust my instincts, was screaming at me to stay home. Rebecca looked effortlessly elegant in white jeans and a navy blazer as I got into their car. "Sarah, you look so much better. This will be exactly what you need." Emma bounced excitedly in the back seat. "Aunt Sarah, Daddy says we might see whales from the ferry." "That would be incredible," I said, forcing enthusiasm I didn't feel. Michael, usually shy around adults, chattered about sea creatures and ferry boats while Daniel navigated Seattle traffic toward the Mukilteo terminal. For a few minutes, surrounded by family conversations and children's laughter, I almost relaxed, almost forgot why I was afraid of the man driving the car. The ferry ride to Whidbey Island was genuinely beautiful. Bright June sunshine, choppy water with a good breeze, and the Olympic mountains rising dramatically in the distance. We stood on the upper deck while Emma and Michael ran around pointing at seagulls and scanning the horizon for whales that never materialized. "Look how happy you seem," Rebecca said, linking her arm through mine. This was such a good idea. And I was happy, despite everything. Something about being on the water, breathing salt air, watching the endless horizon made my fears seem smaller and less urgent. For 45 minutes, I forgot about surveillance and inheritance clauses, and my growing certainty that my brother wanted me dead. That was exactly what they'd counted on. The property was stunning, a small cottage perched on a bluff overlooking Puget Sound, with a private wooden staircase leading down to a rocky beach. Linda, the enthusiastic real estate agent, led us through the house while the children explored the overgrown yard. "As you can see, it needs updating," Linda chirped, gesturing at the dated kitchen and wood-paneled walls. "But the bones are solid. And that view? You could sit on that deck for hours just watching the water." "Sarah could finally have the art studio she's always dreamed of," Daniel said, measuring the largest bedroom with his eyes. "Perfect northern light. And completely private," Rebecca added meaningfully. "Your nearest neighbor is almost half a mile away. Total solitude for creative work. Complete solitude. No witnesses." The tour lasted about an hour. Linda gave us her business card and drove away in her red Prius, promising to call with comparable listings. Daniel suggested we explore the beach before heading home. "The kids are having such a great time," he said reasonably. "And low tide is perfect for checking out the tide pools." The wooden stairs leading to the beach were weathered and steep, with several loose boards and a railing that wobbled when you gripped it. I held on carefully as we descended, Rebecca ahead of me, Daniel close behind. Emma and Michael had run ahead and were already splashing in shallow pools, shrieking with delight at the crabs and sea anemones they discovered. "Careful on these rocks," Daniel called to them. "They're slippery with all that seaweed." The beach was treacherous, large boulders covered in wet kelp, tide pools deeper than they appeared, and waves that surged unpredictably against the rocky shore. I watched Emma venture close to the water's edge and felt a spike of anxiety. "Maybe they shouldn't get so close to the waves," I said. "They're fine," Rebecca dismissed. "Kids need to explore nature. Besides, we're watching them." But Daniel wasn't watching the children. He was watching me. I had wandered toward a particularly large tide pool when Rebecca called out excitedly, "Sarah, come see this enormous starfish!" She was pointing toward the water's edge, about 20 feet away, right where the waves were breaking hardest against the rocks. I should have stayed where I was, should have listened to every instinct screaming danger. Instead, I picked my way carefully across the slippery rocks toward where she was pointing. "I don't see anything," I called, scanning the churning water. "Right there in that deep pool by the big boulder," she insisted, gesturing more emphatically. I stepped closer to the edge, leaning forward to peer into the foaming tide pool. The waves were bigger here, and the rocks were black with wet seaweed. Salt spray hit my face as the tides surged against the shore. "I still don't see—" That's when I felt his hands on my back. The push wasn't hard, it didn't need to be. I was already off balance, leaning forward over treacherous rocks. Daniel's hands connected just above my shoulder blades, and suddenly I was falling forward into the churning water. My head struck the boulder with a sickening crack. Pain exploded through my skull as I hit the water, and immediately everything went wrong. My coordination was gone, my vision blurring. Blood streamed from somewhere on my scalp, turning the water pink around me. The current was stronger than I'd realized, pulling me away from the rocks, away from any chance of climbing out. I tried to swim, tried to call for help, but my brain wasn't connecting properly to my body. I was drowning, and there was nothing I could do about it. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was Daniel's voice, carrying perfectly over the sound of waves. "Oh my God! Sarah fell! She hit her head!" He sounded completely panicked, completely innocent, completely believable. As darkness closed over me, my final coherent thought was crystal clear. My brother had just tried to murder me, and he was probably going to succeed. I should have died in that water. Head trauma plus hypothermia plus Puget Sound equals death statistics that don't leave much room for optimism. But sometimes the universe has different plans than the people trying to kill you. Marcus Webb was launching his kayak from a hidden cove about 400 yards south when he spotted something floating near the rocks. At first, he thought it was debris, a log, or piece of driftwood, but as he paddled closer, he realized it was a person, a woman, floating face up, unconscious but somehow still breathing. He told paramedics later that he'd never seen someone so close to death still clinging to life. My lips were blue, my pulse barely detectable, and there was so much blood in the water around my head that he was certain I wouldn't survive the trip to shore. but he pulled me into his kayak anyway and started paddling one-handed while calling 911. I don't remember any of this. The head injury had given me what doctors call retrograde amnesia. I lost about 4 hours of memory surrounding the incident. But I've reconstructed what happened from police reports, medical records, and Marcus's detailed testimony. What I do remember is waking up. The first sensation was beeping, constant, rhythmic, electronic. Then the smell, that distinctive hospital combination of disinfectant and something more organic underneath. My mouth felt stuffed with cotton, and when I tried to open my eyes, fluorescent lights stabbed into my brain like ice picks. "She's awake," someone said. A woman's voice, gentle but professional. I managed to crack my eyes enough to see a nurse checking the machines I was apparently connected to. Behind her, the room slowly came into focus: white walls, a window showing gray Seattle sky. And sitting in the visitor's chair, looking appropriately haggard and worried, was Daniel. "Sarah," he said, jumping to his feet with perfect relief. "Thank God. The doctors weren't sure how this would go." My throat was too dry to speak, but I managed a questioning sound. "You fell at the beach," Daniel explained, moving closer to the bed. "On Whidbey Island, remember? You hit your head on the rocks and went into the water. A kayaker found you and called for help." "Fell." He said I fell, but I couldn't remember falling. Couldn't remember anything from that day except the kids, I managed to croak. "Emma and Michael are fine. Scared, but fine. Rebecca took them home. She wanted to stay, but someone needed to be with them. They saw everything happen. Everything. They saw Daniel push me, or they saw what Daniel told them. They saw their aunt having a terrible accident. You've been unconscious for 18 hours, he continued. Severe head trauma, hypothermia, near drowning. The doctors said if that kayaker had been 5 minutes later, he didn't need to finish. We both understood how close I'd come to dying. Over the next 2 weeks in the hospital, as sedation wore off and my cognitive function slowly returned, I tried to piece together what had happened. But those crucial 4 hours remained a complete blank. I remembered the ferry ride, the house showing, walking down to the beach, then nothing until waking up in intensive care. Retrograde amnesia is common with this severity of head injury, Dr. Martinez explained during one of his visits. The trauma disrupts the brain's ability to consolidate memories around the time of impact. Those memories may never return. But everything else is clear, I said. I remember details from before that day perfectly. That's normal. The amnesia typically affects only the immediate time frame around the trauma. Your long-term memory should be completely unaffected, which was both blessing and curse. I couldn't remember Daniel pushing me, couldn't prove the crucial moment that would expose it as attempted murder. But I could remember everything else. The surveillance, the break-ins, the inheritance clause that made my death worth millions to him. Daniel visited every day, playing the devoted brother role to absolute perfection. He brought flowers, magazines, updates from my school. Several teachers had sent get-well cards, and constant reassurance about my recovery. The doctors say you might have some lingering effects, he told me during one visit, his concern carefully calibrated. Balance issues, possibly some cognitive problems. Nothing permanent, hopefully, but recovery might take time. Cognitive problems. If I started acting confused or irrational, who would believe me if I accused him of attempted murder? Daniel, I said carefully, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. I can't remember anything from that day. He settled into the visitor's chair, his expression shifting into what I now recognized as performance mode. We were exploring the tide pools. You were looking at something. Rebecca had found a large starfish in one of the deeper pools. The rocks were incredibly slippery from all the seaweed. You leaned forward to get a better look and just lost your footing. Where were you when it happened? About 15 feet away, helping Michael retie his shoe. He'd gotten it soaked and was complaining. Rebecca started screaming, and I looked up just in time to see you hit the water. It was a perfect story. Detailed enough to be believable, but not so elaborate as to seem rehearsed. Exactly the kind of story an experienced attorney would construct. Did you try to help me? To pull me out? Something flickered across his face so quickly I almost missed it. Of course I tried, but the current was strong, and you disappeared under the water immediately. By the time I got to the edge, you were already being pulled away from shore. And then? I called 911 while Rebecca kept watching for you to surface. The Coast Guard arrived about 15 minutes later. But by then, he shrugged, letting me fill in the implications. By then, it should have been too late. But I was still alive, still breathing, still a problem that needed solving. Marcus Webb visited me once during my hospital stay, and his account was the most illuminating. I wanted to see how you were recovering, he said, looking uncomfortable in the sterile hospital room. When I pulled you out of that water, I honestly thought you were gone. Can you tell me what you saw? From your kayak? He looked surprised by the directness of my question. What do you mean? When you found me, what exactly did you observe? Marcus thought for a moment. Well, I was launching from the cove about a quarter-mile south. I was facing the water, organizing my gear, when I heard shouting. A woman's voice, very distressed. I looked toward the sound and saw people on the beach near some stairs. How many people? 3 adults, I think, and children. They were gathered at the water's edge, pointing out toward where you were. Could you see what they were doing? Not clearly too far away, but one of them was on a phone, calling for help, I assumed. That's when I spotted you floating near the rocks. How long between the shouting and when you reached me? Maybe 8 minutes? I had to paddle against the tide to get to you. 8 minutes in 58-degree water with a head injury. Most people would have been dead already. After Marcus left, I lay in my hospital bed processing this information. Daniel had called 911 quickly smart because it made him look like a panicked brother trying to save his sister. But he hadn't tried to swim out to me, hadn't attempted any kind of rescue. He'd stood on that beach and watched me drown, except I didn't drown. And now he had a bigger problem than before. When Dr. Martinez came for evening rounds, I was ready with my questions. Doctor, is there any chance my lost memories might return? Possible but unlikely. With retrograde amnesia, memories that don't return within the first few weeks usually don't return at all. And the other effects? Balance problems, cognitive issues? Those are resolving nicely. I'm optimistic you'll make a complete recovery. You're young, healthy, and responding well to treatment. Complete recovery. No permanent damage. No convenient excuse for Daniel if I started acting paranoid or making accusations. That night, alone with only the soft beeping of monitors for company, I made a decision. Daniel thought he'd gotten away with it. He thought the head injury had conveniently erased my memory of his murder attempt. He thought I was just his grateful sister, lucky to be alive, ready to go home and resume my quiet little life. He was wrong about all of it. I couldn't remember the push, couldn't prove it in court, couldn't convince anyone that my loving brother had tried to murder me for my inheritance. But I knew the truth. And now that I knew, I could start planning. Daniel had made one critical mistake when he pushed me off those rocks. He'd left me alive, and I wasn't going to waste that opportunity. 6 weeks after I nearly died, I was supposed to be grateful. Grateful to be alive, grateful for my family's support during recovery, grateful that the accident hadn't caused permanent damage. Everyone kept telling me how lucky I was, how miraculous my survival had been. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like prey that had escaped a trap, only to discover the hunter was still circling, still patient, still planning the next attempt. The official story was flawless, naturally. Sarah Mitchell, grieving and distracted after losing her parents, had tragically fallen from slippery rocks while exploring tide pools with her loving family. She'd suffered severe head trauma and nearly drowned, but thanks to a good Samaritan and rapid emergency response, she'd survived with minimal lasting effects. The media coverage was brief, but positive local teachers' brush with death becomes story of resilience and family support. People at school treated me like a walking miracle when I returned in September. Even the insurance company seemed satisfied with the circumstances. But I knew better. Surviving an assassination attempt changes you in ways that aren't immediately obvious. On the surface, I looked the same, maybe a bit thinner, maybe more cautious around water, but essentially the same Sarah Mitchell who taught second grade and painted watercolors on weekends. Underneath, I was different, harder, more observant, and absolutely committed to staying alive long enough to prove what Daniel had done, because I knew he'd try again. The first confirmation came during my follow-up appointment with Dr. Martinez in early August. I'd been cleared for normal activities and was scheduled to return to teaching after Labor Day. My cognitive function had returned to baseline, my balance issues had completely resolved, and the visible scarring was minimal. "You've made a remarkable recovery," Dr. Martinez said, reviewing my test results. "I'm releasing you to full activity with no restrictions." What about the memory loss? Any possibility those hours will return? Extremely unlikely at this point, but honestly, that might be a blessing. Sometimes our minds protect us from traumatic memories we're not ready to process. If only he knew how desperately I wanted to remember. That afternoon, I stopped by Daniel and Rebecca's house to share the good news about my clean bill of health. I found them in the kitchen, Daniel reading case files while Rebecca organized school supplies for the upcoming year. "Sarah!" Rebecca looked up with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How did your appointment go?" "Perfect. Dr. Martinez says I'm completely back to normal." Daniel's reaction was subtle but telling. For maybe half a second, his expression shifted. It wasn't relief or happiness that crossed his face. It was something else entirely. Disappointment. "That's wonderful," he said, recovering quickly. "We've been so concerned about long-term complications." "No complications at all," I confirmed, watching him carefully. My memory, coordination, everything is exactly like it was before the accident. And your memory of that day? Still blank? There it was, the question he'd been building toward. The information he needed to assess his situation. Complete blank. Dr. Martinez says it's permanent. The relief on his face was unmistakable. In his mind, I was the perfect victim alive, but with no memory of his crime. No threat to his carefully constructed narrative. Well, the important thing is that you're healthy, Rebecca said, returning to her supplies. Maybe it's better that you don't remember. It must have been terrifying. I stayed for coffee and listened to them discuss vacation plans. Emma's violin lessons, Michael's soccer season, normal family conversation that felt surreal when you knew you were sitting across from people who'd tried to murder you. As I was leaving, Daniel walked me to my car. "Sarah, I've been thinking," he said with practiced casualness. "Maybe you should consider that vacation we discussed. Somewhere relaxing, give yourself time to fully process everything." "I'm fine, Daniel. Really. I know you are. But maybe somewhere with better security? I worry about you living alone in that apartment, especially after what you've been through." Better security. Translation: somewhere it would be harder for me to disappear without witnesses. I appreciate the concern, but I'm comfortable where I am. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Just know the offer stands. If you ever want to get away, even for a weekend, Rebecca and I would be happy to help you find something appropriate." That evening, I sat in my apartment, now equipped with a professional security system I'd installed during recovery, and made a decision I should have made months earlier. I couldn't prove Daniel had pushed me, but I could prove other things. The surveillance, the break-ins, the pattern of behavior leading up to the attempt on my life. I hired a private investigator. Janet Ross came recommended by a college friend who specialized in domestic law. She was in her 50s, gray-haired and professionally dressed, with the kind of face that made people want to trust her, which she explained was exactly why she was effective at her job. "People underestimate middle-aged women," she said during our first meeting at a coffee shop near Pike Place Market. "They think we're invisible. It's remarkable what people will say and do in front of someone they consider harmless." I told her everything: the inheritance, the surveillance, my suspicions about Daniel and Rebecca, the convenient accident that had nearly killed me. I showed her copies of the will, police reports from the break-ins, medical records from my hospitalization. "You understand," she said after reviewing the materials. "Even if I can prove your brother was having you watched, that doesn't prove he pushed you off those rocks. Memory loss from head trauma is well documented. Without witnesses willing to contradict the official story, I know. But if I'm right about the surveillance, if we can establish a pattern of suspicious behavior, maybe we can prevent him from trying again." "You think he will try again?" I thought about Daniel's reaction to my clean bill of health, the disappointment he'd tried to hide when he learned I was fully recovered. "I'm certain of it. $8 million is a lot of motivation." Janet took the case that day. Over the next month, she worked systematically. She identified the men who'd broken into my apartment, professionals who specialized in corporate espionage and personal surveillance. She traced their payment through shell companies back to a law firm that had done work for Daniel. She documented Daniel's financial problems: the over-leveraged mortgage, private school tuition he was struggling with, Rebecca's gambling debts from her failed gallery venture. Most importantly, she discovered that Daniel had taken out a life insurance policy on me just 3 weeks after our parents' death. $2 million that, combined with my inheritance, would solve all his financial problems permanently. "He's methodical," Janet said during one of our meetings. "Everything is carefully planned, legally defensible, designed to look like coincidence. But the pattern is unmistakable. What do we do with this information? We could approach the police, but honestly, it's all circumstantial. A competent attorney, which your brother certainly is, could explain away every piece of evidence." "So he gets away with it?" Janet smiled, and for the first time I saw something predatory in her professional demeanor. "I didn't say that. I said the police might not be able to help us. But there are other approaches to situations like this. Such as? Your brother thinks he's the only one who can play chess, Sarah. But he's not the only intelligent person in this game." That was when Janet Ross taught me the most important lesson of my new life. Sometimes the best defense is a perfect offense. And sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to become a more effective one. The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. Daniel wanted me dead because alive, I was worth nothing to him. But dead, I represented $8 million. What if we could change that equation? What if we could make him worth more to me dead than alive? It took 4 weeks to set up the trap. 4 weeks of careful planning, legal maneuvering, and the kind of detailed preparation that would have made Daniel proud if he'd known about it. But he didn't know. Nobody knew except Janet and me. By the time Daniel realized what was happening, it would be far too late to stop it. The beautiful thing about justice, Janet said, stirring cream into her coffee, is that the best kind doesn't feel like revenge at all. It feels like the natural consequence of someone's choices. We were sitting in her office, a surprisingly organized space above a used bookstore in Capitol Hill. The woman across from me had just outlined a plan so elegant, so perfectly calibrated, that I was beginning to understand why she'd been worth her substantial retainer. "Walk me through it one more time," I said. Janet pulled out a leather notebook filled with her precise handwriting. "Your brother's entire strategy depends on your death appearing accidental. He can't afford suspicion, because suspicion leads to investigation, and investigation exposes his financial problems and that convenient insurance policy." "Right. So we give him exactly what he wants, another opportunity to kill you that seems completely accidental, except this time we control every variable." The plan was sophisticated. Over the past month, Janet had been carefully seeding information where Daniel would discover it. Through Rebecca's art world connections, she'd arranged for casual mentions that I was considering a hiking trip to Olympic National Park. She'd planted details about my interest in remote trails, places where people occasionally got lost or injured. "He'll see it as perfect," she explained. "Solo hiker becomes disoriented, falls from a cliff, gets lost in wilderness. Happens multiple times every year. Nobody questions those kinds of accidents. You're certain he'll take the bait?" Janet's expression was confident. "I've been studying your brother for 2 months. He's arrogant, desperate, and convinced he's more intelligent than everyone around him. He's already started researching hiking fatalities in Olympic National Park." The next phase was even more clever. Through Janet's network, she had contacts in surprisingly diverse places. We arranged for me to accidentally encounter Daniel at his favorite coffee shop near his office. "Sarah!" Daniel looked genuinely surprised to see me, which meant his acting skills were even better than I'd suspected. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" "Meeting with my financial advisor," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "About the inheritance. I figured it was time to learn how to manage real wealth responsibly." Interest flickered in his eyes. "That's smart. Anyone I know?" "Patricia Chen. Rebecca recommended her, actually." Of course she had. Patricia was one of Janet's associates, specifically chosen to feed Daniel information about my growing confidence with my inheritance and, more importantly, my plans. "How has your recovery been going?" Daniel asked. "You look wonderful, by the way." "I feel wonderful. Better than I have in months. Dr. Martinez says I'm completely back to normal." "And returning to work?" "Actually, that's something I wanted to discuss with you." I leaned forward, letting enthusiasm enter my voice. "I'm thinking about taking an extended sabbatical. Maybe early retirement. With the inheritance, I can afford to pursue things I've always dreamed of, such as adventure, real adventure. I've always wanted to do serious hiking, multi-day backpacking trips in remote areas, the kind of challenging experiences Mom and Dad never had time for." Daniel's expression remained supportively interested, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He was already calculating possibilities. "That sounds incredible. Where were you thinking?" "Olympic National Park, probably. Some of those backcountry trails look amazing." Patricia suggested I start with something challenging but manageable. Build my confidence gradually. "You'd be going alone?" "Most likely. I know it's not the safest choice, but I need some solitude, you know? Time to process everything that's happened and figure out what I want my life to look like now." We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the time we parted ways, I could practically see his mind working. A solo hiking trip in dangerous wilderness. A wealthy woman alone on treacherous trails. Another tragic accident to befall the Mitchell family. It was exactly the opportunity he'd been waiting for. That evening, Janet called with confirmation. He took the bait faster than we anticipated. "Our contact at the outdoor equipment store says he was there this afternoon, asking detailed questions about hiking gear and purchasing topographic maps of Olympic National Park." "How do you have contacts everywhere?" "Professional development over 20 years. The important thing is that he's moving quickly. We need to be ready." Being ready meant weeks of preparation that would have impressed military planners. Janet had relationships with park rangers, wilderness guides who specialized in search and rescue, and even contacts in the medical examiner's office who might prove useful if things went wrong. We selected our location carefully, a section of trail that appeared treacherous but was actually manageable if you knew what you were doing. Janet had hiked it extensively during her own outdoor enthusiast period. "The key," she explained, showing me photographs of the area, "is that it looks like an ideal place for an accident. But there are actually several hidden escape routes and safe positions that aren't visible from the main trail." We planted information about my specific hiking plans through Patricia, who had mentioned to Rebecca that I was planning a solo trip to a particular area of the park during the first week of September. Rebecca would naturally share this with Daniel, who would begin planning his own hiking excursion to the same location. The insurance policy remained crucial to our strategy. Janet had discovered that Daniel had increased the policy amount just weeks after my hospital discharge, apparently confident his next attempt would be more successful. The new amount was $2 million, enough to solve his immediate financial problems and provide long-term security. But here's the elegant part, Janet said during one of our evening planning sessions. Life insurance companies investigate suspicious deaths extremely thoroughly, especially when policies are recent and payouts substantial. They employ their own investigators, forensics experts, and have very strong financial incentives to avoid fraudulent claims. So, even if he succeeds, he might not get the money. He won't succeed. But when he tries and we document that attempt, the insurance company will be very motivated to ensure he never sees a dollar of that payout. The final component was the most dangerous. I had to actually give Daniel the opportunity to attempt murder again. We'd create circumstances where he could act on his lethal intentions, but this time, we'd be prepared. Are you absolutely certain about this? Janet asked the night before we implemented our plan. We could still approach the police with what we have. It might not result in charges, but it would put him on notice. I thought about the sensation of Daniel's hands pushing me toward those rocks, the cold water closing over my head, waking up in the hospital while he performed concern. I thought about his disappointment when he learned I'd made a full recovery. I'm certain, I said. He tried to kill me once and he's planning to do it again. The only way this ends is if he's stopped permanently. And you're comfortable with the potential consequences for him? I smiled, and I could feel how different this expression was from any I'd worn before my accident. It was harder, colder, and completely without mercy. Janet, my brother pushed me off a cliff into freezing water and left me to die. He's planning something worse this time. Whatever consequences he faces, he's earned them. 3 days later, I loaded my backpack and drove to Olympic National Park, ostensibly alone, ostensibly unprepared for what awaited me on those trails. But I wasn't alone. I wasn't unprepared. And Daniel Mitchell was about to discover that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. Olympic National Park in early September is magnificent. Late summer light filters through ancient Douglas firs, creating cathedral-like spaces between massive trunks. The air carries scents of moss and rain, and that distinctive Pacific Northwest combination of earth and evergreen that makes you feel like you're breathing in the essence of wilderness itself. Under different circumstances, I might have genuinely enjoyed the experience. Instead, I was walking into what I hoped would be the final confrontation of a drama that had begun 8 months ago with my parents' death. Every step was calculated, every pause orchestrated for the audience I knew was following, because Daniel was definitely following. Janet's network had confirmed his presence in the park parking lot just 15 minutes after my arrival. He was maintaining distance, probably waiting for me to get far enough from popular trails that my accident wouldn't be witnessed by other hikers. The recording device I wore was remarkably small. Concealed beneath the sports bra Janet had insisted I purchase from a specialized electronics supplier. Every word I spoke would be captured, every sound transmitted to the team of professionals Janet had positioned throughout the area. Testing. 1, 2, I said quietly, as I paused for water at the first mile marker. Can you hear me clearly? Janet's voice came through the nearly invisible earpiece. Crystal clear. Remember, stay on the main trail until you reach the overlook. That's where we expect him to make his approach. The overlook was strategically perfect, a scenic viewing area where the trail followed a cliff face approximately 200 feet above a rocky canyon. To anyone observing from a distance, it would appear ideal for a hiking accident. Someone steps too close to the edge, loose rock gives way, and suddenly you have another tragic story about the dangers of solo wilderness adventures. What Daniel couldn't know was that Janet had spent 3 weeks preparing that location. She'd reinforced the ground near the edge, installed nearly invisible safety equipment, and positioned rescue gear at strategic points along the cliff face. If I went over the edge, I'd fall approximately 12 feet onto a concealed padded ledge. It would be uncomfortable, but it wouldn't be fatal. More importantly, it would provide us with everything we needed to destroy him legally and financially. I reached the overlook around noon, precisely on schedule. The view was breathtaking, miles of green wilderness extending toward the Olympic Mountains, with glimpses of the Pacific Ocean visible in the distance. I took several photographs, posted them to social media with a caption about the joy of solo adventure, and settled onto a convenient boulder to eat lunch, and waited. Daniel appeared approximately 25 minutes later, emerging from the tree line with the casual demeanor of someone who'd simply happened to be hiking the same trail. He was wearing expensive gear, premium boots, high-tech backpack, clothing that cost more than most people spent on entire outdoor wardrobes. Sarah? He sounded appropriately surprised and delighted. What are the chances of this? Daniel! I stood up, letting my expression show genuine surprise and pleasure. What are you doing here? Same as you, I suppose. Patricia mentioned you were considering hiking in this area, and it sounded so appealing I decided to experience it myself. Rebecca thinks I need more physical activity. Patricia. Perfect. Our fictional financial advisor had played her role flawlessly, providing Daniel with just enough information to make him feel the opportunity had naturally presented itself. This is incredible, I said, gesturing toward the panoramic view. I'm so glad I decided to challenge myself like this. Solo hiking can be hazardous, though, Daniel observed, moving closer. Especially in remote areas like this. People become disoriented, make navigational errors, step too close to dangerous edges. I've been extremely careful, I assured him. Though I have to admit, some of these drop-offs are intimidating. Look how far down that canyon goes. I walked toward the overlook, stopping approximately 6 feet from the edge, close enough to appear careless, far enough that I could react if he moved too aggressively. Daniel followed, his expression shifting to what I now recognized as his analytical mode. He was studying the terrain, calculating angles, considering how to make it appear accidental. You know, he said conversationally, Mom and Dad would have been so proud seeing you like this, confident, independent, embracing new challenges. I hope so. Sometimes I wonder what they'd think of the decisions I've been making lately. What do you mean? The inheritance changed everything. I never expected that level of financial responsibility. I turned to face him, letting calculated vulnerability enter my voice. Sometimes I feel guilty about the disparity, like maybe you should have received a larger portion. Something shifted in his expression: interest, anticipation, the look of a predator sensing opportunity. Sarah, you deserve every dollar Mom and Dad left you. They recognize something special in your character. Did they, or did they simply pity me, the struggling teacher, the unmarried daughter who never quite achieved their expectations? Don't diminish yourself. Daniel moved closer, his voice warm with manufactured sympathy. You're the strongest person I know. Consider how you've handled everything, losing them. The accident at the beach, now this solo adventure. You're genuinely inspiring. The accident at the beach. He couldn't resist referencing it, couldn't help reminding me of how close he'd come to succeeding the first time. I don't feel strong, I said, stepping back toward the precipice. Most of the time I feel lost, like I'm pretending to cope when I'm actually falling apart inside. That's completely normal after trauma. But you're healing, Sarah. You're becoming who you were always meant to be. He was positioning himself now, measuring distance and angles, calculating the force required. I could see it in his eyes, the same cold calculation I'd glimpsed that day when I'd told him about the inheritance. Daniel, I said, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever think about what would happen if something happened to me? With the inheritance and everything, I mean? His smile remained perfectly composed, but I detected a slight pupil dilation. Why would you ask something like that? I don't have children, no husband. If I died tomorrow, what would happen to all that money? Sarah, please don't talk that way. Nothing's going to happen to you. But hypothetically, what if it did? What if I fell off this cliff right now? I gestured toward the edge, watching his reaction intently. Then, I suppose... He paused, pretending to consider the question for the first time. Then legally, it would revert to the estate. Probably to me as next of kin. So you'd inherit everything? Theoretically. But Sarah, I don't want to discuss this. It's morbid and unnecessary. $8 million, I said softly. That would solve significant problems, wouldn't it? Daniel became very still. What exactly do you mean by that? I know about the second mortgage. Daniel, the credit card debt, Rebecca's gambling losses, the private school tuition you're struggling to afford. I know about the life insurance policy you purchased. The mask slipped. For just a moment, I saw my brother's authentic expression, cold, calculating, the face of someone who'd already committed murder and was prepared to do it again. Sarah, he said carefully, I think you might be confused about certain facts. Am I confused about what happened at the beach? About the fact that you pushed me into that water? You fell. You know you fell. You don't remember anything from that day because of your head injury. I remember enough. I took another step toward the edge, and Daniel moved with me like a dance partner following a familiar routine. We were close now, close enough that I could see perspiration on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. Daniel, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the thin atmosphere, did you arrange our parents' death too? The question hung between us like something tangible. Daniel's face cycled through multiple expressions: shock, confusion, and then something that might have been relief. Sarah, you're genuinely frightening me now. I think the head injury affected you more severely than doctors realized. You're developing paranoid delusions. Am I? Or am I finally seeing clearly for the first time in my life? Our parents died in a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light. You were at the funeral. You heard all the details. A drunk driver who happened to be your former client, Tyler Morrison. The DUI case you got dismissed on a technicality 2 years ago. Daniel's hands were trembling with adrenaline now, with the excitement of someone about to solve all his problems with one decisive action. Sarah, I think we need to get you psychiatric evaluation. This paranoia, these elaborate conspiracy theories, it's not healthy or rational. The only thing that's not rational, I said, turning my back to him one final time, is thinking you're going to get away with this twice. I heard his footsteps behind me, felt the shift in air pressure that meant he was raising his hands, preparing to push me over the edge exactly as he had at the beach. But this time, I was completely prepared. This time, Daniel Mitchell was walking into a trap that would destroy him utterly. And this time, I was ready to fight back. The push came exactly when I anticipated, forceful, between my shoulder blades, with enough violence to send me stumbling toward the cliff edge. But instead of terror, I felt something approaching satisfaction. Finally, after months of planning, Daniel was providing exactly what we needed to destroy him. I let myself fall forward, arms windmilling as if desperately trying to maintain balance, releasing a scream that echoed dramatically off the canyon walls. To anyone observing, especially Daniel, it appeared exactly as he intended, his sister losing her footing and plummeting to her death. The crucial difference was my knowledge of the concealed ledge. I struck the reinforced platform Janet had installed approximately 12 feet down, my fall cushioned by climbing equipment she'd positioned there weeks earlier. It was painful. I'd have substantial bruising for weeks, but I was completely uninjured and very much alive. More importantly, the recording device had captured every word of our conversation, including Daniel's failure to deny orchestrating our parents' murder and his obvious intent to kill me. Above, I could hear Daniel breathing heavily, probably peering over the edge to confirm I was actually dead this time. What he observed was an apparently empty canyon. Janet had positioned the ledge to remain invisible from the overlook, and I was pressed against the rock wall, completely hidden from view. "Sarah?" he called, his voice carrying just the right note of panic. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Silence. Because dead people don't respond. I heard him moving around above, probably rehearsing his story before calling for help. In my earpiece, Janet's voice was calm and professional. "Perfect execution. How are you feeling?" "Like I just got pushed off a cliff," I whispered back. "Any injuries?" "Just my dignity. And maybe my tailbone." "Excellent. Now stay exactly where you are. Daniel's about to call 911, and we need this to unfold precisely as planned." The emergency call came approximately 5 minutes later. From my hiding position, I could hear Daniel's voice carrying down from the overlook, and it was a masterpiece of calculated deception. 911 emergency. My sister just fell from the overlook on Hurricane Ridge Trail. She's not responding. I think she might be... His voice broke convincingly. "I think she's dead." The operator's voice was professionally calm. "Sir, can you see your sister? Any signs of movement?" "No, I can't see her at all. The drop is too steep. She was standing near the edge taking photographs, and some loose rock gave way under her feet. I tried to grab her, but it happened too quickly." "Are you injured, sir?" "No, I'm fine, but Sarah..." God, how am I going to tell her students? She teaches 2nd grade. Those children adore her. Even knowing it was performance, I had to acknowledge his skill. The grief sounded completely authentic, and his story was perfectly constructed, detailed enough to be believable, emotional enough to discourage excessive questioning. The search and rescue team arrived within 45 minutes, exactly as Janet had arranged. But these weren't ordinary park rangers. They were Janet's carefully selected professionals who knew precisely what they were investigating and how to handle what they discovered. From my concealment, I observed the meticulously choreographed performance. Daniel led them to the overlook, indicating where I'd supposedly fallen, his expression a perfect mask of devastation and shock. He answered their questions with exactly the right combination of grief and confused helplessness. "We were just talking about how beautiful the view was," he told Rodriguez, the team leader who owed Janet substantial favors. She seemed happy, excited about challenging herself with solo hiking. Then she stepped closer to get a better photograph angle and Rodriguez nodded sympathetically while taking detailed notes. "These accidents occur more frequently than people realize. Sir, the rock can be unstable, especially after recent weather. Will you be able to recover her body? We'll do everything possible. But I should warn you, falls from this elevation, survival chances are essentially zero." Daniel's shoulders sagged with what appeared to be genuine relief. In his mind, he'd finally succeeded. His problematic sister was dead, the inheritance was his, and the insurance policy would provide immediate financial security. He had no idea that every word he'd spoken during the last 2 hours had been recorded. or that the body recovery operation was actually an elaborate investigation designed to expose his crimes. The elegance of Janet's strategy was its fundamental simplicity. While Daniel drove back to Seattle to begin his grieving brother performance, Janet's team would discover evidence from the canyon that told a completely different story than Daniel's account. They found the recording device I'd worn, supposedly damaged during the fall but with its memory intact. They found traces of my blood on rocks near the edge blood I'd provided earlier from a deliberate finger cut. They found my damaged camera, its memory card miraculously preserved, containing photographs that showed another person's reflection during those final moments. Most significantly, they found physical evidence inconsistencies suggesting the fall hadn't been accidental. "The trajectory is wrong," Rodriguez explained to the insurance investigator who arrived the following day. "If she'd simply lost her footing, the physics would be different. This suggests she was pushed with considerable force." The insurance investigator, another of Janet's network contacts, was extremely interested in this information, especially when combined with the recording of Daniel essentially confessing to murdering our parents and planning my death for financial gain. But the most beautiful component of Janet's plan was yet to come. While Daniel met with funeral directors and practiced his eulogy, Janet was arranging my miraculous rescue by rock climbers who'd supposedly detected movement in the canyon 2 days after my disappearance. According to the official narrative, I'd fallen onto a narrow ledge and suffered concussion, surviving on rainwater and determination until the climbers located me. Miraculous but documented, there were verified cases of people surviving similar falls under comparable circumstances. I was airlifted to a hospital in Port Angeles, where Janet's medical contacts confirmed I was alive, but suffering from severe hypothermia, dehydration, and memory loss from the second head trauma I'd supposedly sustained. The news broke Thursday morning. Local teacher survives miraculous fall, brother overjoyed at recovery. Except Daniel wasn't overjoyed. When Janet called his office to deliver the news, she reported you could have heard silence echoing through the phone line. "Alive?" he finally managed. "Are you absolutely certain?" "Very much alive, Mr. Mitchell. Injured, but expected to make complete recovery. She's asking to see you." Another extended pause. Then, "Of course, I'll be there immediately." But he didn't come to the hospital. Instead, he did exactly what Janet had predicted when cornered. He attempted to flee. The insurance investigator was waiting at his house when he arrived to pack. Detective Morrison from Seattle Police was positioned in the driveway, and Janet Ross was waiting in his living room, recording everything. "Hello, Daniel," she said when he walked through his door for the final time as a free man. "I think we need to have a serious conversation." The expression on his face when he realized he'd been systematically outmaneuvered was everything I'd fantasized about during those months of planning. Pure terror, exactly like I'd seen in that conference room 8 months ago. But that was merely the opening act. The real performance was still to come. Daniel's arrest dominated local news for 3 days, but the story reporters told wasn't complete. They covered insurance fraud and attempted murder, described a respected attorney who'd tried to kill his sister for money. They mentioned surveillance, suspicious circumstances around both the beach incident and the hiking trip, recorded conversations proving premeditation. What they didn't know, what only Janet and I knew, was that Daniel Mitchell hadn't just tried to kill me twice. He'd succeeded in murdering our parents. The confession emerged during his interrogation, 4 days after his arrest. I watched through one-way glass at the police station, Janet beside me, both of us listening as my brother finally revealed the truth about that January night. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said, slumped in his chair across from Detective Morrison. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. He looked like someone who'd exhausted all his lies. "What wasn't supposed to happen, Daniel? The crash, their deaths. I just wanted them to reconsider their decision about the inheritance, to see what Sarah was really like, irresponsible, immature, unworthy of their trust." Morrison leaned forward. "Tell me about the night your parents died." Daniel stared at his hands for a long time before speaking, his voice barely audible. "I knew their routine perfectly. Every anniversary, same restaurant, same route home, same timing. Giuseppe's to Queen Anne, down Pine Street to 4th Avenue, then up the hill. Never varied, not once in 20 years. Continue. Tyler Morrison, no relation to you. Detective was a client. DUI case from 18 months earlier. I got the charges reduced to reckless driving, saved him from jail time and license suspension. He was grateful, said he owed me. My blood turned cold. Tyler Morrison, the drunk driver who'd killed our parents, had been Daniel's client. I told him I needed a favor, something to shake up my parents, make them realize they were becoming too old and fragile to live independently, maybe cause a minor accident, just enough to make them more reliant on their children, on me. You paid him to cause an accident? Not a fatal accident. Daniel's voice rose defensively. Just something minor. A fender bender. Maybe force them off the road into a ditch. Something that would frighten them, make them reconsider giving Sarah so much control over their legacy. But it wasn't minor. Tyler was supposed to just tap their rear bumper, maybe cause them to slide into the shoulder. But he'd been drinking more than planned, much more. He hit them at 50 miles per hour. Daniel's voice cracked. The impact killed them instantly. I felt Janet's steadying hand on my arm as the room spun around me. My parents hadn't died in a random accident. They'd been murdered by their own son, killed because he wanted to manipulate them into changing their will. What happened after the collision? Tyler called me in complete panic. He thought he was facing vehicular homicide charges. I told him to maintain the story that he'd been drinking at a fraternity event, that he never saw their car, that it was just a tragic accident. And the inheritance? Were you aware of the will's contents before their deaths? Daniel looked up with something resembling surprise. Aware of it? Detective? I helped draft the original version. The words struck me like a physical blow. Janet's grip on my arm tightened as we processed this revelation. You helped write your parents' will? Not officially, but I was their son and their attorney. They trusted me to help them understand legal implications of their estate planning decisions. When they began discussing updates, I guided them toward arrangements that seemed equitable. Equitable? Sarah was always their favorite, but she'd made impractical life choices. Teaching instead of law, art instead of stable career advancement. I convinced them she needed incentives to mature, to accept real responsibility. 60% of 14 million seemed like appropriate motivation. Morrison was documenting everything carefully. But you expected to inherit eventually anyway. Why arrange their deaths? I didn't arrange their deaths, Daniel shouted. I arranged a minor accident to make them more dependent on me, more likely to recognize Sarah's limitations when she inevitably failed to handle the responsibility maturely. When she panicked, when she proved incapable of managing the inheritance, they would have revised the will. But they died instead. But they died instead, Daniel repeated hollowly. And suddenly Sarah was wealthy. And I was trapped by the consequences of what I'd set in motion. So you decided to murder her. I decided to solve the problem I'd created. If Sarah died, the inheritance would revert to me as specified in the will. The life insurance would cover our immediate debts. Rebecca and I could start over with a clean slate. And after she survived the first attempt, Daniel's public defender tried to intervene. My client doesn't need to answer that. But Daniel was beyond caring about legal strategy. If she'd survived the beach, I would have tried again, and again, until I succeeded. $8 million was worth considerable persistence. Like at Olympic National Park? Olympic National Park was supposed to be perfect. Remote location, dangerous terrain, solo hiker taking foolish risks. It happens constantly. Except it didn't work this time either. For the first time since his arrest, Daniel smiled. It was cold, bitter, completely without humor. No, detective. It didn't work. My sister apparently has remarkable survival instincts. That night, I sat in my apartment trying to process everything I'd learned. My parents were dead because Daniel had wanted to manipulate them into disinheriting me. I'd nearly died twice because he couldn't accept that they'd trusted me with their legacy. The money that was supposed to be a blessing had become a curse that destroyed my family and nearly cost me my life. But there was one more revelation waiting, one that would change everything I thought I understood about my parents' final decision. The next morning, Janet arrived at my apartment carrying a manila envelope that would contain the final piece of this terrible puzzle. "Sarah," she said, settling across from me at my small dining table, "there's something I should have told you earlier. Something your parents specifically asked me to keep secret until after Daniel was arrested." I looked at her sharply. "What do you mean? Your parents didn't just hire me to investigate Daniel's financial problems. They hired me to protect you because they'd already discovered what he was capable of." The envelope contained documents that made everything clear. Bank records showing Daniel had been embezzling from the family business for over 2 years. Evidence that he'd forged their signatures on several financial documents. Proof that Tyler Morrison owed Daniel money from gambling debts, not gratitude for legal services. Most importantly, it contained their real final will, the one they'd executed secretly, without Daniel's knowledge, just 1 week before their deaths. They knew, Janet said simply. They knew Daniel was stealing from them, knew he resented your inheritance, knew he was capable of violence, so they changed everything. According to their real will, I inherited not 60%, but the entire estate. Daniel received exactly $1 and a letter explaining why. The will Daniel had been operating under, the one that promised him 40% if I died, was a fake. A document he'd created himself, believing his parents were too trusting to seek independent legal advice. My brother had killed our parents and tried to kill me for money that was never going to be his anyway. Justice, it turned out, had a sense of irony. 6 months after Daniel's sentencing, I stood in the same conference room where this story began, watching his face as his attorney read the terms of the plea agreement he'd just signed. The transformation was remarkable. The confident lawyer who'd once tried to manipulate our parents' will was gone, replaced by a broken man facing life in federal prison. But that wasn't the surprise I'd prepared for him. "Before we conclude," I said, pulling a folder from my briefcase, "there's something Daniel needs to understand." His head snapped up at my voice. We hadn't spoken since his arrest, and I could see him trying to read my expression, attempting to anticipate what final revelation I might have prepared. I spread documents across the conference table where everyone could see them. Detective Morrison, the prosecutor, Daniel's public defender, even Rebecca, who'd somehow avoided charges despite her knowledge of at least one murder attempt. "These are the real estate documents for our parents' house," I began. "The property Daniel marketed immediately after their death, claiming the family needed to liquidate assets quickly." Daniel's attorney frowned. "I'm not sure how this relates to—" "The house sold for $1.2 million, I continued, ignoring the interruption. "Daniel, as a state executor, managed all paperwork. The proceeds should have been distributed according to the will, 60% to me, 40% to him." "That's correct," the prosecutor confirmed. "Financial records indicate—" "The financial records show what Daniel wanted them to show. But these documents reveal something different." I produced a second set of papers. These are actual closing documents, obtained directly from the title company. The house sold for $1.2 million, but Daniel reported the sale price to the estate as $800,000. The room became very quiet. Daniel was staring at the documents with growing horror. He embezzled $400,000 before estate distribution, money that belonged to both of us according to our parents' will. "That's impossible," Rebecca said, speaking for the first time since entering the room. "Daniel wouldn't steal from his own family." "Daniel did steal." I produced additional documentation. Bank records showing deposits of exactly $400,000 into a previously undisclosed account in his name, an account he established 3 days before the house sale closed. The prosecutor was documenting everything. This could constitute additional charges of estate fraud, embezzlement. "It gets worse," I said, savoring Daniel's increasingly pale complexion. "The business accounts, investment portfolios, even Mom's jewelry collection. Daniel skimmed money from every single asset before distribution. Total theft. Approximately $2.1 million from his own parents' estate." Daniel's attorney was examining the documents frantically. "Where did you obtain these? How did you—" "Janet Ross is extremely thorough," I said simply. "She spent months reconstructing every financial transaction Daniel executed after our parents' death. Remarkable what you discover when you understand what to look for." But the financial fraud wasn't the real revelation. That was merely the opening act. "Daniel," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the silent room, "do you remember what our parents always said about justice?" He looked up with confusion and growing terror. "They used to say that justice wasn't about punishment. It was about ensuring truth came to light and people received what they actually deserved." I produced the final document, the one that would devastate him more completely than any prison sentence. "This is their real will," I said, placing it before him. "Our parents' actual final testament, executed 1 week before their death." Daniel's hands trembled as he reached for the document. "That's impossible. I handled all their estate planning. There is no other will." "There is when they didn't trust their estate planning attorney," I said. "It seems Mom and Dad developed concerns about your financial situation and your growing resentment toward me. They decided to make changes without your knowledge." Daniel was reading now, his expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and dawning horror as he processed what he was seeing. "According to their real final will," I continued, "you inherit exactly $1 and a letter explaining their decision. I inherit everything else, including complete control of their legacy." The letter was devastating. Mom and Dad had known perhaps not specifics, but they'd suspected Daniel was capable of terrible things. The letter detailed their disappointment in his choices, their growing awareness of his financial improprieties, and their decision that he couldn't be trusted with their life's work. "The will you've been operating under," I said, "was fabricated. A document you created and substituted for their real wishes, probably hoping no one would ever discover the substitution." "But the attorney," Rebecca whispered. "Harrison Walsh witnessed the signing. He verified." "Harrison Walsh witnessed the execution of a legitimate will," I agreed. "But Daniel had access to his father's office, his letterhead, his official seals. Creating a convincing forgery wouldn't have been difficult for someone with his legal expertise." The prosecutor was staring at Daniel with something approaching amazement. So you murdered your parents for an inheritance you were never going to receive? Daniel couldn't respond. He was staring at the real will, at his parents' signatures, at the notarization that proved its authenticity. Everything he'd done, the manipulation, the murders, the elaborate cover-up attempts had been based on a complete delusion. There's one more thing, I said, producing a final envelope. This is for you, Daniel, from Mom and Dad. It was a video message, recorded 3 days before their death on Dad's old camera. In it, my parents explained their decision to change the will, their growing concerns about Daniel's character, and their hope that someday he would understand their reasoning. We love you, son, Dad said, looking directly into the lens. But love means protecting innocent people and holding people accountable for their choices. You've made choices that deeply concern us. Mom's voice was gentler but equally firm. If something happens to us, we want Sarah to know we trust her completely. She has the integrity and values to preserve what we've built. The recording concluded with both parents saying goodbye, expressing hope that Daniel would eventually find his way back to the person they'd raised him to be. When the video ended, Daniel was crying, not the performed tears he'd displayed at their funeral or during his grieving brother act, but genuine tears for parents he'd lost and choices he couldn't undo. I didn't know, he whispered. I thought they were making a mistake. I thought Sarah was undeserving. So you stole from them, I said. And when that wasn't enough, you killed them for money that was never going to be yours. The plea agreement Daniel signed that day was more comprehensive than anyone had anticipated. In addition to attempted murder charges, he now faced federal charges for estate fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy in our parents' deaths. His 25-year sentence became life without possibility of parole. But the harshest punishment wasn't imprisonment. It was understanding that everything he'd done, every terrible choice, every act of violence, every betrayal of family trust had been completely pointless. Our parents had already decided he wasn't worthy of their legacy. No amount of manipulation or murder could have changed that fundamental reality. Rebecca lost everything as well. The house, cars, lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to all disappeared when Daniel's assets were seized for restitution. She moved back with her parents, taking Emma and Michael, attempting to rebuild from the destruction her husband had created. I felt sympathy for the children. They were innocent casualties of their parents' choices, and they'd grow up knowing their father was a murderer who'd killed their grandparents and tried to murder their aunt for money. But I couldn't summon much compassion for Rebecca. She'd known about at least one murder attempt and done nothing to prevent it. In my judgment, that made her complicit in everything that followed. As for me, I walked out of that courthouse as a very wealthy woman, but wealth wasn't my most significant gain. I discovered I was stronger than anyone had imagined, more intelligent than people credited, and capable of executing long-term strategy with lethal precision when necessary. I'd also learned that justice sometimes arrives wearing an unexpected face. But my biggest surprise was still coming, and it involved what I'd decided to do with the money Daniel had killed for. 1 year after Daniel's sentencing, I stood before the Richard and Margaret Mitchell Community Center, watching second graders run laughing through playground equipment built with blood money transformed into something beautiful. The community center occupied 5 acres in South Seattle, in a neighborhood where children didn't always have safe spaces to play and learn. It offered after-school programs, art classes, tutoring for struggling students, and summer camps for families who couldn't afford childcare. Everything Daniel had tried to steal, I'd given away. Well, not everything. I kept enough to live comfortably, bought a small house with a garden where I could paint in natural light my parents had always wanted me to enjoy. But the majority of the estate, almost $12 million after legal fees and restitution, went into the foundation bearing their names. Are you certain about this? Janet asked, joining me on the small hill overlooking the center. Over the past year, she'd become more than my investigator. She'd become my advisor, my friend, and the closest thing to family I had remaining. Completely certain, I said, watching children play soccer on the new field. This is what Mom and Dad would have wanted. Not just the money, but the purpose behind it. The foundation extended beyond community centers. We provided college scholarships for first-generation students, funded art programs in underserved schools, and supported young teachers who chose to work in challenging communities. Everything my parents had valued, everything they'd hoped their legacy could accomplish. Daniel, serving his life sentence, had been informed of every donation, every scholarship, every program funded by the inheritance he'd murdered for. I'd ensured he understood exactly how his parents' money was being utilized. I'd heard from his prison counselor that he'd begun teaching literacy classes to fellow inmates. Perhaps it was genuine remorse, perhaps another performance, but I chose to believe it represented authentic change. People could transform, even those who'd committed terrible acts, I just wasn't naive enough to trust them again. Any regrets? Janet asked. About which part? Any of it. The plan, the revenge, donating a fortune most people would kill for. I thought about it, observing children play in the fading afternoon light. Do you want to know something strange about this entire experience? What? I'm happier now than before my parents died, before inheriting anything, before Daniel tried to kill me, before any of this happened. Why do you think that is? Because I understand who I am now. For 32 years, I defined myself as the disappointing daughter, the underachieving sister, the woman who'd never quite satisfied her family's expectations. I let other people determine my worth. A group of children ran past us, chasing a soccer ball that had escaped the field. One of them, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8, waved enthusiastically. "Miss Sarah," she called, "come play with us." I waved back, smiling. These children knew me as the lady who'd helped build their playground, who funded their art classes, who attended their games and school performances. To them, I wasn't an inheritance or a victim or a survivor of attempted murder. I was simply Sarah, and that was sufficient. The money was never really mine, I told Janet. It belonged to my parents, and now it's accomplishing what they would have wanted, making the world slightly better, one child at a time. And Daniel? I considered my brother, alone in his cell, probably contemplating how different his life might have been if he'd accepted our parents' decision gracefully, if he'd been satisfied with love instead of obsessing over what he believed he deserved. Daniel gets to live with the consequences of his choices. Every day for the rest of his life, he'll understand that he killed 2 innocent people and attempted to kill a third for money he was never going to inherit. That seems like appropriate justice. The sun was setting behind the Olympic Mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of watercolors I used to create at Pike Place Market. Simple, beautiful, and completely authentic. "Janet," I said, "do you remember what you told me that day in your office? About the best revenge feeling like justice?" I remember. You were absolutely right. But justice isn't just about punishing people who wrong you. It's about ensuring their actions ultimately lead to something better than what they intended. I showed her the photograph I'd taken that morning, a letter from Marcus Webb, the kayaker who'd saved my life. He was starting medical school in the fall, funded by a scholarship from our foundation. "Daniel tried to destroy me because he thought I was weak," I said. "But weak people don't survive what I survived. They don't plan what I planned. They don't donate fortunes to help others. So what's next for the formidable Sarah Mitchell?" I laughed at the description. Formidable. I genuinely liked it. "I'm starting graduate school myself, art therapy program. I want to work with children who've experienced trauma, help them find ways to express what they can't verbalize. Using your inheritance for tuition? Using my salary from the foundation. I kept enough to live modestly. Remember? I've learned that the most valuable things aren't inherited, they're earned." As we walked toward our cars, Janet asked one final question. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Daniel had simply accepted the original will? If he'd been content with 40% of $14 million? I imagined an alternative timeline where my brother had celebrated my good fortune instead of resenting it, where our parents had lived to enjoy their grandchildren, where family dinners remained just family dinners instead of crime scenes waiting to happen. Sometimes, I said. But then I consider these children, the teachers we're supporting, all the positive outcomes that emerged from something so terrible. Maybe this is how it was supposed to unfold." "You really believe that?" I looked back at the community center, at the playground filled with laughter, at the building that bore my parents' names and carried forward their values. I believe that sometimes the worst experiences become foundations for the best contributions. Daniel thought he was destroying my life when he pushed me off that cliff. Instead, he gave me the opportunity to discover who I really was. "And who are you, Sarah Mitchell?" I smiled, thinking about the frightened, grieving woman who'd walked into a lawyer's office 18 months ago to hear a will reading that changed everything. I'm someone who survived, someone who fought back, someone who transformed a curse into a blessing, and blood money into hope, and someone who's not to be underestimated. Definitely not. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more tales of survival, justice, and the unexpected strength we discover when life challenges us beyond our limits. Sometimes the people who try to break us end up revealing capabilities we never knew we possessed. And sometimes, the best revenge really is living well, especially when you're living on their money, using it to make the world better than they ever intended.